who's our communications consultant, and today she is going to focus on the fact that everyone has a story to share, and what is yours. So please welcome Maggie, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Well, good morning. Thanks, Carrie. I'm excited to be here to talk about this. I have been working in the field of whatever you want to call it. Some people call it communications, public relations, marketing. There are a lot of different variations and a lot of overlap, but I've been working in this field for about 20 years, and in that time I have worked with all kinds of different clients, from the smallest grassroots community groups all the way up to big corporations such as Kohler Company, Harley Davidson, Miller Beer, Chipotle restaurants. And in the last several years, I've really started working more and more with professional service providers. So Pharmacy Society, for example, but also dental practices, law firms. I think there's really a need for those types of businesses to have support on outreach and communications, because you obviously have a day job that you're responsible for. Every day you have a to-do list that centers around your pharmacy practice, and you don't necessarily have time to focus on outreach and communications as much as you'd like to. So hopefully we can talk through some best practices and tips today, and share some ideas to help you advance your outreach and communications. So a few things that we will cover today. First off, we'll just talk a little bit about why outreach and communications is important. We'll talk about what makes news, how to step back and look at what you do during your average workday and in your practice, and why it's okay to share stories and toot your own horn, to really get out there and tell people about what you're doing. If you don't tell them, there's a good chance they won't know. We will also talk about some best practices and how to pick and choose which channel you're using to communicate. We live in a very information overloaded age right now, and there are a lot of different channels to use to communicate. So how do you determine which ones are the best? And we'll share some real and recent examples of your colleagues who have shared down some of their stories and made it in an effort to share them. And especially how they've positively impacted patients, which is really, for most of us, the end result. That's what we're looking for, is that positive impact or outcome. And then we'll talk about how to leverage your outreach efforts. Specifically for this group, we're going to talk about how to increase the awareness of CMRs, why they're important, and increase the number of CMRs delivered. So we will jump right in and start talking about the importance of outreach and communications for pharmacies. And to get us started, we're just going to share a quick video clip. We worked with Hyatt Pharmacy just a couple months ago. They have a great story to share, and we were able to help them get this story placed with one of the Milwaukee TV stations. So we'll share that clip as an example to get us started.
In the hustle and bustle of life, Kevin Shing prefers to take his time. The Hyatt pharmacist sees just 4 to 5 patients a day, and he goes to their home.
Good morning.
The one-on-one checkups are part of the Pharmacy Society of Wisconsin initiative to serve the underserved.
They can identify where there are needs for medication, whether that be taking people's medications, adherence, whether it be problems with side effects, getting people off of medications.
Make sure everything is going well and it's on the right track, okay?
Patients are referred by community health advocates. Many in Milwaukee are Rohingya refugees referred by Unite MKE.
Let's start this medication, okay?
Malik Abdul is a diabetic. He takes 7 pills every morning and another 2 every night.
Oh, yeah.
He has a lot.
A lot to manage, made more difficult because Malik doesn't speak or read English. Pharmacist and translator work together to manage Malik's meds.
I draw the lines last time. Does it work?
The counter, there are no distractions and no rush.
We can see what their life look like, what the house setting look like, and what are the things that actually is keeping them away from taking their medication or even taking medication correctly.
Since 2012, pharmacists statewide have made close to 10,000 visits, providing quality care at a comfortable pace. In Milwaukee, Amy DuPont, Fox 6 News. In the hustle and bustle.
Sorry.
So that's just a good example of one story and one channel that was used to tell that story. We're going to dig a lot deeper into kind of all the different variations of that. But for starters, we want to talk about just some kind of general tips to keep in mind when it comes to your outreach efforts. The first thing is to keep in mind that it's not just for consumer products. So communications, public relations, publicity, marketing, it's not just for consumer products. So, you know, often people think of your typical widget, whether that is a pair of running shoes or promoting a restaurant or things like that. But your services are just as important to share through outreach and communications. Part of the reason why is that it can help build and protect your reputation. You know, when you are in an industry where you're serving patients and customers the way you do, your reputation is everything. I'm sure you're all well aware of that. So a proactive and strategic effort to conduct outreach and communications can really help build and protect your reputation. And another thing to keep in mind is that it's an investment in your business. So there are many things that you invest in every day, whether it's technology or team building for your staff. Communications is the same way. It's an investment that when you make that investment, it can really pay off in terms of paying dividends later, increasing efficiencies, and giving you a return on that investment. Another thing to keep in mind is that your patients can become advocates and ambassadors. So they really are your best source of generating more organic word of mouth communication. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about cultivating those relationships to help get and gather those stories of your patients so that they can become your advocates and ambassadors. Outreach really connects you with your patients, customers, and community. It's all about that relationship building and cultivating and nurturing that relationship. And finally, we'll talk more about things you're doing that are newsworthy, things that you do in the course of your day that are worth sharing. And I'm sure many of you do this already. So we would like to stop now and just hear from some of you if you're willing to share just some things, either things you've done in the past or any challenges or successes that you've had as far as outreach and communications. If anyone's willing to share an example or two, then we can actually talk about some of your actual examples as we go through the content today. And you can feel free to chime in anytime during the call if you have questions, or as Carrie mentioned earlier before everybody was on, you do have a chat function on GoToMeeting, so you can also submit questions and comments through that chat function. Does anyone have an example they'd like to share, whether it's a challenge or a success or just something they feel that is newsworthy or worth sharing? We do have lots of other examples in here, so if no one wants to chime in right now, that's fine. Last call for comments right now. Okay, we'll keep going and we'll go through we have lots of other examples that we can talk about as we go. And again, if you have questions as we go through or something comes to mind, an example you want to share, feel free to jump in either using your voice or using that chat function. So how do you get to the essence of your story? You have sort of this big overarching area that is the competitive landscape. And I know you're all in different communities and you have different types of businesses, you have different target audiences, but regardless of where you are, you work within a competitive landscape. So in order to figure out how to differentiate yourself, there are a few questions to consider, and that's what you see on the right of your screen. What are your offerings, or what is your value proposition? What is it that you offer specifically that you think delivers value to the people you serve? Another question to ask is, how are you different? Are there things that you do that you happen to know that none of your competitors do? Or is there a reason that you do them better? So to be thinking about your specific offerings in the context of how are you different and why are you better? Even just stopping and taking a few minutes to just try to jot down the answers to those questions, jot down who are your competitors, what do you offer, and then how are you different and how are you better? Just going through that exercise, it doesn't have to be a day-long retreat. It can really just be you stopping for a few minutes in your day to try to think about and jot down the answers to those questions. Another really important component as you think about your outreach efforts is to define your target audience. So most of you have a variety of target audiences, and again, it's going to depend on your individual pharmacy and your individual community, but you all serve patients, you all work with prescribers, you have a surrounding community that you work within. I know many of you specifically work in long-term care settings, and then there's often the added layer of caregivers, so where you're interacting directly with caregivers and not necessarily as much with a specific patient. So depending on what your audience or who your audience is, really each different audience often requires different specific messages, different tactics, and different channels to use for your communication to them to be effective. And as I mentioned earlier, there are so many different channels to use. It used to be, we used to live more in a world where the yellow pages and the community newspaper and the local TV news were the main channels of getting your message across, or of course your direct interaction, that word of mouth and direct interaction is one thing that's kind of been around forever and hasn't really changed, but pretty much everything else has changed. So I don't know how old each of you are, but I know that when I started working in the field of communications, I would have to stand at a fax machine for hours on end and individually fax press releases to news stations, whether around the state or around the country. And sometimes I would be standing there till 8 o'clock at night, just funneling through press releases individually via fax. So when we actually got software for our computers that allowed us to send a blast fax, that was really amazing. That was a game changer for us. But obviously, it hasn't in the scope of history been that long that we've been dealing with websites and social media and email. So all of those electronic channels just keep growing and changing, and they can be really challenging because social media platforms such as Facebook, they change their rules every day. They change their setup, things move around, settings change, and it can be a lot to keep up with. You also have your pharmacy is also a channel for communication. You might have flyers or brochures around. You have your face-to-face interaction with the people you serve. The news media is an important channel, and I think that was illustrated really well with the clip we just showed of Hyatt Pharmacy. And it's important to note that that's not advertising. So, there's a difference between paying for an ad and having a community news reporter highlight and share your story. And that's not to say that placing that story was free. Carrie could attest that we spent a lot of time on the back end and behind the scenes putting that together and packaging it and pitching it to the news media to get that coverage. What you do in the community, your community relations programs or charitable giving, whether that's your team participating in a run walk or you volunteering your time at a senior center, those are also channels of outreach. And of course, as we keep talking about, word of mouth and just sort of general buzz is also, it's a more organic and a little bit harder to monitor and manage if you don't have analytics the same way you would with website traffic or likes on a Facebook post. But it's a very important channel and worth paying attention to. So we'll talk a little bit more as we go about how to figure out which channels to use and why it's important to be strategic and not try to be all things to all people, but to pick a few things and do them well. But just a couple quick tips that I find helpful. Adding this kind of work to your calendar. I know everyone's really busy, everyone's stretched for time, but if you add it to your calendar, even if you can start with a half hour a week that you stop and pay attention to how you're communicating, that can be an important change and can start to move the needle a little bit. Another thing that might be an easy way, if you have a mechanism to survey your patients about how they prefer to receive communications. Do they prefer emails? Do they prefer text messages? Do they prefer picking up a flyer when they come in? A survey can be as simple as you having an index card size checkbox at your register, or it can be something you do online. There are a lot of free services such as SurveyMonkey that you can put together a brief survey to send out to patients and ask them what they pay attention to. Are they on Facebook? Are they not? Do they visit your website? Do they not? Those kinds of questions. And I should have mentioned earlier that Carrie will send out these slides after, so you'll have these for reference, but also she can include my contact information, and we are certainly happy to talk to people on a case-by-case basis to help you sort out what is the best way to determine how to go about either doing a survey or figuring out which channels you should be investing in, or issues like that we can help with that. So let's talk a little bit about what makes news, what makes something newsworthy. And if you think about your average day and what your average day holds, I bet we can come up with some things that you're doing that are newsworthy, or maybe there are things you've already shared with your community and with your patients. So those might be value-added services, whether it's something like a delivery service or adherence packaging, CMRs, of course. You may have been involved in some kind of trial or pilot program, things you've done in the community, or maybe something unique or innovative you're doing with your team, or how you manage your team. So stop one more time and just ask if anyone has some examples or an example they'd like to share about something they're doing that might be worth sharing. Anyone?
This is Nicole from Stru's Pharmacy. I guess one of the things that we're doing that's slightly unique is we are doing long-acting antipsychotic injectables as an alternative for the patient having to go to the doctor's clinic. Some patients have to come to our pharmacy, pick up their shot, and then have it administered at the doctor's office. And then others are just enrolling in our administration program, and they have a pharmacist administer it right on site.
Great. And where is your pharmacy located, Nicole?
Green Bay.
You're in Green Bay. Okay, great. Yeah, that's an excellent example. Do you happen to know if that's something that other pharmacies in your area are doing, or is this something new that you're pretty sure you are leading the way on?
I'm sure there are other pharmacies in the state. I'm not aware of any others in our locale.
Yeah, and that's a great example. As we talk about what makes news, there are a lot of things that I know you all do every day that are important and worth sharing. But in particular, anytime you can say that you are doing something new or different, that is something that isn't being done by another pharmacy in your community, or even if it is, perhaps there's something about the way you're administering that service that makes it a little bit more comprehensive or a little bit more personalized to the patient. And we'll talk a little bit more at the end about how we might help you pull out some of those key points and story angles. But in particular, it sounds like you're doing something that it's not something that's commonly understood as, hey, I'm just going to the pharmacy to pick up my prescription. People tend to think primarily of that filling and dispensing role. And when you're doing something different and unexpected like that, that is a great newsworthy story. So thanks for sharing that example. So as Nicole sort of set the stage here, but we want to take just a few minutes to go through, Carrie had assigned prior to the webinar to watch a few video snippets from the annual meeting, and I think those were some longer videos, but we pulled out a couple highlights just in case you didn't have a chance to watch them, or just to sort of reiterate the importance of some of these stories that highlight different innovative services, partnerships, etc. So we want to just take a couple minutes to go through a few of these examples.
Program right now is older adults. Why did you do this? We reached out to the Pharmacy Society of Wisconsin. The unique element of this partnership with both initiative that we're working get out into the community and serve families that may not necessarily be served at their pharmacies. Very comprehensive. It's an opportunity one-on-one for approximately an hour for that pharmacist to talk to and the spouse/caregiver to help them understand their medicine. The two elements that we, I had them multiple, well, just give me a little extra time to get my patient profiles that are going on that they might not possibly develop. And we became weight watchers leaders. We just really felt like it was a good opportunity for the pharmacy to really highlight the public health aspect of weight loss. Grant County, the county that we reside in, is very, very high. So it's just one of those things that goes along with medication management that being no brainer. So what I decided. So I thought this would be good. And a number of people. So after we met and really discussed what the goal of this program was, make sure that they understood how to take their blood pressure and what that meant. And for some patients, we really took it a step further. If they had diabetes, let's tie that into your blood sugar. We're taking your blood pressure. Let's take your blood sugar. You're supposed to be doing it anyway. And it's a lot easier to change some activities, diet and exercise if you're seeing that what you're doing is making. It was really in depth. It was nice. She had a lot of great suggestions for me. I went home the first time with a list of goals for myself. With a beautiful blood pressure scheme. I was floored when she said, "I'll contact your doctor and we'll how she feels about increasing, whether I'm calling a prescription in or whatever. I've never known that pharmacists necessarily can communicate with your doctor." I remember My husband takes quite a few medications, and then I take about half of what he takes. So what they do is it may take several months, but they try to get all of your medications synced at the same time so that they come due and they get filled at the same time. You're not making multiple trips to the pharmacy, which is nice because it's 10 miles round trip for us to come into the pharmacy.
All right, so I'm not sure how many of you had a chance to watch those videos before, but we wanted to share those just to give an idea of some of the types of stories we've been spending some time talking about on this end. And a few of those that you saw, we've actually been working behind the scenes with different media contacts, working with some of the pharmacists involved in those programs to try to advance stories in the media and to create content for e-newsletters and things like that. So let's just use those as a segue to talk about how we can turn some of those ideas and some of those great things you're doing into action. So I think the first thing is, Nicole shared one great example, but we want to hear from you. If not today, just after you've had a little bit of time to digest the content that we're talking about today, but we want to hear from you about some of the types of things you're doing, whether that's working with local falls prevention programs or something having to do with transitions of care, immunizations, other value-added services, things you're doing in the workplace that are innovative, MedSync programs, and of course DMRs. So, as you all know, that's not something that is necessarily being done on a regular basis in all pharmacies throughout the state, but it's an important service, and that's why we're here and that's why we're talking today. So how can you package that in a way to really communicate that that's important and relevant? So how and where to share news. One thing we'll talk about in a little bit, but I want to make the point here. When you have news to share, it's you have a lot of different channels to share it through, and it's okay to share it through all those channels. So I can think of a lot of examples of people who say, well, I put that out on Facebook, so now everybody knows about it. I don't want to send it out in my e-newsletter because people will think it's just redundant and read it in two places. I'm more of the mindset, especially as more and more time passes and communications gets more and more fragmented, to repurpose content and share it across multiple channels. If you do an email newsletter and you check what your read rates are or your open rates, an average for that for most businesses is anywhere between 5 and 20%. So you might send something out in an email and only 1 in 5 people, or sometimes fewer, are reading it. The way Facebook works, if you put something out on Facebook, there's not a great chance that even people who follow you are going to see it, just because of the way Facebook does their algorithms, and because it just depends on who your followers are. If they follow 100 different pages, they're not going to get 100 different pieces of news in their news feed from all those different pages they follow. They might get a handful of those. So there's a really good chance when you put stuff out, it's either not necessarily being seen, or even if it is, it's being scrolled past or glanced at and deleted. So think about that as you're thinking what kind of news you have to share, that you have all these different opportunities to share the same news, either in your store, through printed materials such as a postcard or a brochure. Your local news media might be an option. And then, of course, those electronic channels, your email, social media, and website. And surrounding all those things is your community, your target audiences and your community are all surrounding that circle of where to share news. So a few things that I encourage people to definitely do. One thing Carrie and I have talked a lot about, and I can't emphasize this enough, as you saw in the videos we just watched, I think the patient testimonials or the patients sharing their story, those are really the most compelling ways to illustrate what you're doing and why it's important. I love in the video the woman who talks about MedSync, and she talks about how to get to the pharmacy for them it's 10 miles round trip, or 10 miles each way, and that's a barrier for them, and so there's a real value to that service they're receiving. I love the woman who talks about the Weight Watchers program and how Michelle in Boscobel says, put me out of business. That's a great value-added service. If you're helping someone lose weight and they're able to get off some medications, that's a great end result. So I really encourage you to establish a process, if you don't have one, to establish a process to collect patient stories and testimonials. It's a lot easier if you do it on an ongoing basis and on the front side, obviously taking into consideration any release forms that need to be signed and making sure you have consent and that there are no HIPAA concerns. Second thing I definitely recommend you do is learn to toot your own horn. I think this is a huge barrier I've seen with clients I've worked with across all different types of businesses at all ends of the spectrum. It's just hard when you're going about your daily routine to step back and think about, hey, this is really a great thing I'm doing and I should tell people about it. I should shout it from the rooftop. When you're doing something valuable or providing a valuable service, it's great to share it. Don't be afraid to share it. Don't be afraid that you're going to sound like you're, tooting your own horn too much. If you're doing great things, talk about it, because other people aren't going to talk about it for you. As I mentioned on the last slide, definitely do repurpose content and share it across multiple platforms. And we'll talk about this more in the next couple minutes about how to start with the bullets and get to the highlights of the story, but then you can use that same content and repurpose it appropriately so that it can be an e-newsletter blurb or a social media post or a flyer or the basis of a news story. And then definitely do pick up the phone and contact a local media representative. Reporters are people too, and they have, they rely on people telling them what's going on in the community. Sometimes they go and sniff out stories on their own, but often the stories they write about and the things they cover are the result of somebody proactively sending them a pitch or connecting with them and saying, hey, I know you write about healthcare, so I think that you'd be interested in X, Y, or Z that our pharmacy is doing. It's providing a valuable service, and here's how. Or it's delivering good results for our community, and here's how. So a couple of different ways that we can help support you as you're doing this. We are happy, Carrie really leads the efforts here, and I've been supporting on that, and staff here supports that as well. But we can really help you brainstorm ideas and serve as a sounding board. If you think you have something you want to share, but you're not quite sure how to go about it, we can definitely help brainstorm and serve as a sounding board. We can also help with developing talking points or actually writing content. If you have a need and for some reason you can't get to it or you just feel you need help getting started, we can actually help with those talking points and with that content development. We have a lot of local media relationships we've developed throughout the state and can assist with helping you determine who are the best people in your local community to contact, and sometimes even make those introductions if we have an existing relationship. We work with a whole network of community partners and different types of organizations in the community, and we can help suggest which partners in your community. No doubt you already know some of them and are working with some of them, but maybe there are ways to expand and enhance those partnerships. That's another place we can help. PSW does a great job with their social media, email, and Carrie does have her own WPQC newsletter as well. So those are all opportunities, and there's obviously the PSW Journal as well. Those are all great places where we can help share your news using those existing PSW and WPQC channels. And we do have a host of already developed free promotional materials if you don't already have them: patient brochures, prescriber brochures, prescription pads, window clings, and all sorts of great info already created and at the ready. So we do have a bit of a challenge, a little bit of an assignment for session 5 coming up in March. We'd like to ask everybody to summarize a news item. Just try to come up with a few simple and concise bullets. Some of you may already have this if you've been doing outreach either on social media or with your local media or any partners. But summarize a news item in a few simple, concise bullets. Then identify at least 2 channels you could use to share the story. So whether that's social media and a newspaper article, or a flyer for your in-store use, what are 2 channels you could use to share the story? Come up with 1 local media outlet you could connect with to pitch the story to. And then identify at least 2 community groups or local organizations. And these might be people you already know and are working with. We're not asking you to recreate the wheel or make something up if you're stretching it for community groups, but to identify at least 2 local community groups or organizations you could connect with who might be partners or might be interested in this story for whatever reason. So Carrie's going to ask for that information to be ready for session 5 on March 13th and 14th.
So I'll just jump in there, Maggie. Definitely we'll touch base and we'll give you kind of reminders about this, but our opportunity with Maggie here is a really great opportunity, and I can definitely say that we would not have gotten the 2 or 3 spots that we've gotten media coverage on without Maggie's help. She's greatly connected and can really help us to tell your stories, and that will just help us to tell more stories going forward. We've been able to have her to support this work through the CMMC grant, which is, as I've mentioned before, the grant that's allowing us to provide the final product verification work as well as this CMR work group with sort of a marketing twist to it as well. So since you guys are kind of clustered in the Fox Valley as well as kind of south of Dane, Rock County, et cetera, we really hope to be able to make some headway in the next few months in telling some of your stories. Some examples could be, as Nicole mentioned before, long-acting antipsychotics. That would be a great thing to let people know that you're doing. Just the story about final product verification and comprehensive medication reviews, of course, that is something that could help increase just the awareness and maybe some referrals. Any other kind of community organizations that you're working with already, whether it be about immunizations or comprehensive medication reviews. And then, like on our last call, Nicole also had a really good example of them doing comprehensive medication reviews in assisted living facilities. So all of those are just some really good ways that if you haven't told those stories to your local media, these are really great things that you guys are doing that are unique and people need to know about. So I just encourage you to get excited about this. I'm super excited. It's really fun working with Maggie, and we'll figure out the next steps going forward and talk about session 5. But a great time to write these things down would be now that you're thinking about, we've kind of caused you to focus on thinking about this right now. So we'll have some follow-up. I'm going to turn it back to, do you have anything else you want to say, Maggie? Or?
No, I think we would just love to hear if you have any immediate questions. If anyone, again, wants to share an example and talk through how we might go about packaging that and sharing it or pushing it out. We wanted to start early today so we'd have time for questions at the end. So I would just encourage you either type in the chat box or just throw out whatever questions you have. We have a little bit of time that we could answer and talk through some examples.
And if you do have ideas that are coming to your mind now, if you're too shy to share them on the call, that's totally fine. Please email Ryan and I, though, because we would love to start thinking about like where the outlets are that we could maybe use any connections that we have or work with you specifically to start getting the word out, and not wait till our conversation in March. So anyone else have some ideas?
anybody willing to share, has there been are there any barriers you can think of or specific challenges? I know just anecdotally, Carrie and I have talked about the fact that if you don't use Facebook a lot, you might jump on and find that they've moved things around. So where you used to be able to find certain things, they've moved or settings have changed. Obviously, we know time is a big hurdle for everyone. I don't know anyone today in any job who doesn't have time constraints and challenges with, resource management and allocation. Does anyone have a specific challenge they want to share that we could talk about? Because if you do, chances are other people do as well.
I guess I could offer something we've been thinking about, and I showed up a little late, so I apologize if we already maybe reviewed this a little bit, but one of the things we think would be kind of neat is if we had more Google reviews online, because I think people will look up pharmacies, or even like you think about looking at restaurants, so you look up the reviews first, and just trying to find ways to get more reviews, I guess, on Google. We're not sure like what might be the best way to do that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that brings up a really good point in that, so reviews, whether on Google or Facebook or any other channel, they can be, sort of a blessing and a curse, because if they're good reviews, that's great. If you get a negative review, I always encourage people to be prepared. You have to make sure you're monitoring that and managing that, because if you do get a negative review, it's really important to respond promptly. That negative review will live online unless it gets taken down by the person who posted it. So, definitely, I encourage all of you to seek out reviews, and we can talk a little bit about how, but I would just put the caveat out there that it's really important to be prepared if you do get a negative review, how you're going to respond to that. And I think the best way to respond is by, as soon as possible, reaching out to that patient or customer and addressing whatever issue they brought up. That kind of personal response can go a long way to getting that modified or taken down, or at least mending a relationship that from their perception seems to be damaged. I also want to make the point that there's a little bit of a difference between reviews and testimonials. So a lot of, some of the videos we watched today, some of the video examples were really more patient testimonials. We went and sought out, let's just take the Weight Watchers example in Boscobel. We talked with Michelle Farrell there and specifically wanted to talk to some folks who were satisfied with their participation in Weight Watchers and felt that it was beneficial and positive. So we went and sought out those positive stories. That doesn't mean every single person who's participated in that had a positive experience, but we went and sought that out. So reviews on Facebook or Google can be a great way to find people who are happy. So just like you want to address any negative reviews, also positive reviews can be a great way for you to reach out to a patient and say, wow, I saw that Google review or Facebook review you posted, and we're so pleased you had that experience. We've been wanting to talk more about this service. Are you willing to share your experience? So that can be a good way to find some of those folks. In terms of how to actually encourage people to post those reviews, there are a couple different ways that can work. And I'll go back to something I said earlier when we were talking about patient surveys. Depending on your target audiences and your, what technology you have in place, trying to gather those patient reviews might be as simple as, do you have a bag insert that you pop in asking people, please rate us on Google or please rate us on Facebook? Do you have something, just a little index card size thing that you have at your counter or a little sign that just prompts people, gives them that reminder? Hey, if you were happy with your service today, please tell folks about it using Google or whatever channel. So there's some fairly simple ways you can do that, in your pharmacy. Also, depending on what, if you do an email newsletter or if you do social media, for example, if you do use Facebook to promote your services, you might just put a post up every once in a while that says, if you're satisfied or if there's something we're doing that needs work, please tell us. You know, there is always a risk in seeking out those reviews. My guess, knowing what I know about the people I've worked with in this group so far, is that you all do really great work. But there is always that risk in asking. So I always caution people to just be ready to respond immediately if you do get a negative review. And certainly, I'm happy to talk with anyone individually, depending on if you want to talk in more detail about what types of systems you have in place, like what technological systems you have in place. Is there a mechanism that right after point of sale, you can issue an email to folks with a link where they could post a review if they're so inclined? So it's going to, you know, the answer is going to be different for everybody, but those are just a few ideas to get started. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Appreciate that. Yeah, I think what we liked about the reviews idea, I know you mentioned that a lot of times you might end up with a couple bad reviews, but I think some of our thoughts are that you see a store or a restaurant with no bad reviews and you think to yourself, well, you know, are these really true reviews, or are they like selecting? Or, you know, I guess when you see a bad review, you kind of think to yourself, well, you know, everyone's going to have some type of bad review or a bad experience. I think that's kind of normal. But to see, you know, out of 100 reviews, 99 of them were positive, and one was bad, I think that adds a lot of truth, you know, to...
Yeah, absolutely. And it can take some time. I mean, I know that you know, I work with some people who have 0 Google reviews, and we're trying to boost that number. So we do have a lot. And if it is a net positive over time, if you know, if you got 4.8 out of 5 or 4.6 out of 5, people are going to look at that and see that as a net positive, and they're not necessarily going to read through. If there are that many, they're not necessarily going to read through them all. Yeah, I hear what you're saying about the risk of wondering if that's the real deal. But you know, the good news is that a lot of those channels are set up so that you know, to kind of weed out any false reviews. You can't really go in and plant your own positive reviews unless you're going to set up 18 different Google accounts for yourself and take the time to go in and post fake reviews. A lot of people just do that. It obviously happens, but I think it's a little bit less of a concern. But I think overall the main takeaway is to just make sure if you're soliciting reviews that you are monitoring them. I think it's great to respond to positive reviews, and it's absolutely necessary to respond to negative.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, any other questions? Other issues or questions? Okay. I'm just curious if I could, there's a couple of people who, because I want to give you credit for being on today. There's a couple of people on here who were not identified actually on the attendees. So if you don't hear your name, will you let me know that you've been on the line? So I have Carrie Schaefer, Curtis, Brian Gibbs, and then Nicole. And I think there's 2 other people on the line. Would you mind letting me know who you are? Or if you're on mute, you can just send me an email. Super. I'll take no answer as yes. So, all right. Well, we really thank you guys for being on the call today. And we will be following up. Hopefully this was useful for you. Let us know if it, you know, how you thought of it, if you thought it was good, if it was all stuff you knew already, or if it really piqued some thoughts in your head that you will be able to utilize going forward. And then like Maggie said, we really want you to start thinking about like the bullet points to tell a specific piece of your story, and we want to help you. So I hope you can take advantage of this help. I've really enjoyed having Maggie here, and she's fantastic. So we'll talk to you guys later. Drive safely. I don't know how the roads are everywhere else, but be careful on the ice. So have a really good day, everybody, and thanks much. We'll talk to you next week on the call.
Sounds good. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.